safety technology, pardon me, I got
Sorry
that.
about that.
No worries, are popping up at a pretty quick pace, at a pace that's difficult for companies to really manage and understand, their value, but they're interested, right? So these companies are really coming out to market without good evidence for their use. So we'll take our time today to level set on what is the evidence in the scientific literature for some of these technologies. Specifically, I want to discuss collaborative robotics, sensing wearables, and industrial exoskeletons as the topics for today. I do need to make sure I note that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer or any other company. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started on collaborative robotics, otherwise known as cobots. And first, just to define what I mean by cobots, I'm talking about collaborative robots designed specifically to directly interact with humans in a shared space to accomplish a shared task. And so I've adapted this image from Matheson and colleagues from 2019. And you can see on the left, there's kind of the traditional cell workspace where you have your automation in a completely separated and barricaded zone from your humans, from your workplace and your workers. So that's the traditional automation setup. You can also have a coexistence model where they are in a shared space, but not necessarily collaborating on a shared task. And then when it comes to cobots, you can have many different types of operational models. You can have a serial model where they're operating in a shared space on a shared task, but not necessarily at the same time, where the human might work on a certain task or item, and then the cobot takes over after that, or vice versa. You can also have a cooperative model where they are working on a shared task at the same time in the shared space, but perhaps the individual is working on item 1 while the cobot works on item 3. And then you have a truly collaborative model where the human and cobot are working on a shared task in a shared space and at the same time on the same item. There are a lot of different cobots out there these days that span applications from manufacturing, construction, agriculture, retail, product delivery, hospitality and restaurants, warehouses, grocery, you name it. They're all over the place. And you have both industrial cobots and also service cobots out there. And on the upper right, I have an image of a floor cleaning device a picture that we took while we were in a retail shop. And it was moving around, cleaning floors while we were in there and as customers. And on first interaction, it was interesting because my wife felt like it wasn't turning out of her way sufficiently, so she kind of scooted herself over to the edge of the aisle as quickly as she could, and the robot ended up stopping only after it was beside us rather than ahead of us. And so then that was the first interaction. Second interaction, we were a little more rambunctious, a little more interested. And so we tested, when it was slow to stop with a cart in front of it versus with us in front of it. It could be perception and not accuracy, but there was this perception that perhaps it stopped earlier for the cart than for a person. And while this is truly a coexistence model, they weren't doing the same task or shared task in a shared space. What it does get to is the importance of acceptance and trust of this new technology in order to make it function and make it work. So why are people introducing cobots into workspaces? And so there are a number of potential benefits to using these cobots. Number one, perhaps it could support reducing overexertion. This is the number one injury in workers' comp. We're talking about manual material handling, lifting, lowering, pushing, pulling, carrying, things like that. And so the cobot could be doing some of that heavy lifting, if you will, to reduce that risk. It can also potentially reduce occupational disease by handling noxious chemicals or fumes, things like welding cobots and the like. It can reduce repetitive motion by taking on those repetitive tasks. And obviously, companies are interested in this from a productivity or efficiency point of view. Cobots are interesting because they require a bit of a smaller footprint than traditional automation at a lower cost. So it's available to a broader market than perhaps traditional automation. It can also help to affect employment shortage. So a lot of these very difficult jobs are having a hard time filling them, and so cobots can help support that. Now, with these potential benefits, you have potential changes in risk. Obviously, if you're interacting a person with a machine, you potentially increase your risk for caught in, struck by, and electrocution injuries, whether it be by the worker, in the case of industrial cobots, or in the case of service cobots, you have the same kind of general liability concerns as well for customers who might be interacting. Product liability could also shift. It could shift for the better or for the worse. So as you are interested in automation, that kind of reflection of automation could mean that you miss certain quality assurance tests because you're depending on the automation. On the other hand, the automation might do better than the human eye, and oftentimes these cobots are actually deployed for quality assurance and perhaps improving product liability in that case. If you are becoming dependent on automation, you do have to worry about business continuity in cases of equipment breakdown. So that's an additional risk to consider. If you're using service cobots, particularly in uncontrolled locations, such as product delivery, you have to worry about things like vandalism and theft. Anytime you have a connected device with communications and digital communications, you have enhanced risk for cyber and cybersecurity. It can change your property risk. So if you have mobile cobots roaming around your premises, or even if they're handling materials in a stable location, you could damage those materials, or if it runs into any property, it could damage that property. Fire risk could also change. So some of these warehousing activities may have very large plastic binning structures that are automated with cobots. And so these large plastic binning structures can change your fire risk, not necessarily for the better. So with potential benefit comes potential risk. Now you'll note that I'm using the term potential because I mentioned that we're going to talk about what the research community knows in terms of efficacy. And so I'm showing you here in reference to Gualtieri and colleagues who did a systematic review on industrial cobots. What I show you on the right is a reimagination of the papers they reviewed by topic. You can see there's a lot of work going on in motion planning and control for contact avoidance, contact detection, and mitigation. There's also a significant literature for sensor systems and object tracking, some safety management work. When looking at the physical ergonomics work, it tends to be focused on task scheduling strategy to optimize what portions of the work should be drawn to the human versus to the cobot, and not a whole lot of work on long-term safety risk or changes in risk for the better or for the worse. When you look at their case studies and application data that they were able to review, there were only a few case studies that were small in scope and short term. So we really do need continued research to assess changes in safety and risk with long-term deployment. Now that's in terms of efficacy. There is a better literature out there on acceptance. And when it comes to acceptance of cobots, the themes of the day are empowerment and safety, mattering most to employees. So here I show you a conglomeration of 4 different references here. And really, if I were to put my spin on what I read from these documents, the actions you can take to improve cobot acceptance include, first and foremost, focusing your purpose on safety with retraining of your existing workforce. And that is in comparison to focusing on productivity with workforce reduction. So anytime you talk automation, the #1 risk to acceptance is job security and individuals losing their work. So focusing on using cobots to improve the safety of your work and your operations with retraining of the existing workforce obviously expands acceptance to the employee. You can also involve the user in the implementation process. And what's most important about this is to make sure that you address their feedback. So they are your primary user of this device. They should be your primary customer, if you will, in its testing. And so that means making sure that you assess their feedback and make good on that feedback and address it. Now you can address both empowerment and safety if you allow the cobot to respond to the workflow of the employee rather than the cobot pacing the work. You should also make sure that any stop distances and speeds not only meet the safety thresholds and standards or guidelines, but also meet that employee's levels of perceived comfort. And by allowing that, you really empower them to be in charge of their work and to use the cobot as a tool to support their work. Another thing to do is to make sure you communicate situations that could lead to system events, such as robot failure, and outcomes of those events. One of the worst things that can happen to employee acceptance is to have an unexpected failure of service, and that could harm acceptance right away. So rather than being in a reactive mode to something that goes wrong, empower the employee to understand what the limitations of the cobots are, so that they can proactively identify situations that are of concern and mitigate those concerns rather than having to react to something unexpected and lose acceptance. And then lastly, acceptance is not a static thing. It can change with experience. So it's important to survey and address employee perceptions multiple times during your implementation process. When looking at the literature on service cobots, they're being used with customers as opposed to industrial cobots with workers. The top things here that matter are really service. So the number one acceptance antecedent is usefulness, and the number one basis to usefulness is their trust. So you need to make sure you have a cobot model, a service cobot model that is trustworthy to your customer. This could be by way of changing how the cobot communicates, the roles and responsibilities of the human versus the cobot, even how the cobot looks and its form factor could change views of trust and therefore views of usefulness. And then additionally, adequate service is paramount. So something that the Merkle study identified was that while customer ratings of customer satisfaction are fairly similar with a cobot interaction versus a human interaction when service is successful, when service fails, that customer satisfaction rating lowers to a greater degree with a cobot than with a human. So it's absolutely important to have a human in the loop who can recover when service fails and make sure that you address the customer as needed and more effectively. So that's what I have on cobots. I'd like to move next to sensing wearables. When I talk about sensing wearables, I'm talking about sensor systems that can be worn on the body during daily activity, hopefully unobtrusively and long-term. There are a lot of different types of sensing wearables out there. The most popular are inertial measurement units, which have sensors in them that can detect accelerations in space, angular velocities in space, and orientation in space. And really, they're used to assess the quality of a person's movement when they're worn on the body. And so this can be done to assess lifting technique or manual handling technique, awkward postures, things of the like. You can also evaluate a person's physiology by recording things like heart rate, sweat, and breath rate, even brain waves, muscle activity, and the like. And these things can be brought together to understand a person's state of fatigue, perhaps their emotional state, such as depression, and things like heat strain and heat stress. You also have augmented and virtual reality devices. These are primarily used for the purpose of online instruction and training. And then these wearables can be outfitted with external kind of dosimeters, if you will, for things like organic volatile compounds in the air, noise dosimeters, as well as for proximity sensing, where they can identify when a person is in kind of proximate location to a risk, such as forklifts or powered industrial trucks of some kind. So a lot of different types of sensing wearables out there for industry use for a lot of different purposes. With regard to efficacy, there's this nice study that's been done by Stefano and colleagues. This is a systematic literature review. They were able to identify 24 studies. And just to give you the basis, the conclusion right now is that the jury is essentially still out. So a large number of their studies, 16 of 24, were focused on this movement sensing and identifying unfavorable postures during different types of tasks. Most of the studies were also done in experimental settings, in lab settings, not in actual workplaces. And so they rightly conclude that wider applicability in real contexts and stronger validation would be highly recommended. Thinking more about this very popular use case that's out there right now, which is the posture-based wearable sensing of risk. A recent study came out by nursing colleagues where they essentially did gold standard biomechanics measurement in the lab with simulated lifting tasks. And what they did is they isolated the signals to mimic what one inertial measurement unit worn on the body could give you and what perhaps insole force sensing could give you as idealized signals. So these signals are of better quality than a wearable would be able to provide, but they've just isolated which ones they used to mimic one IMU and one insole force sensing. They then performed machine learning models to estimate peak lumbar moments for either with just trunk motion from the kind of idealized IMU or both trunk and force signals together. They simulated multiple lifts in work days from randomly selected lifts from their laboratory tasks. And then they used something called the lift tool, which comes out of Auburn and is essentially a biomechanically based model of low back pain risk. And they estimated the injury risk from these idealized IMUs or as kind of sensing versus the gold standard use of the laboratory equipment. They found that just having trunk motion from one idealized sensor on the trunk had a very low correlation to ground truth in terms of injury risk. And they found that the correlation was much higher and pretty strong when you add the underfoot force kind of pressure insole data to that. So there is some potential benefit there. They conclude that results raise questions about the adequacy of a single IMU for a low back pain disorder risk assessment, and combining an IMU, that is an inertial measurement unit, on the trunk and pressure insoles may be able to accurately assess risks. Now, I will put an additional asterisk on that, from our experience looking at pressure insoles, their durability in real world settings and their quality of signal is not going to be like a laboratory force plate. And so there is definitely need for further research. And the author group would agree with me on this, that we need more research in actual work settings on work tasks over longer periods of time to really understand this. But what it does point to is that if you are an employer looking at using these movement wearables, there's more work to be done to kind of critically evaluate the evidence that your vendors have in terms of their ability to be accurate and to understand injury risk. Another review that recently came out, this is a scoping review from Lee and colleagues. They assessed the data on feedback from wearables, and so posture-based feedback. So some of these wearables will offer the ability to provide vibration, so vibrotactile feedback, or auditory or visual feedback, depending on the product, when you meet some threshold for a bad posture or bad movement. And what they found here was that these wearable sensing technologies may actually improve posture. So the evidence is suggesting that it does change postural behavior, but may not actually improve pain. They also note that the quality of studies limits the strength of this conclusion. And I will put a bold highlight on that second half, that the quality of studies is pretty weak here in the academic literature. In their particular review, they had a total of 14 studies in office, healthcare, or lab environments. Only 2 studies actually evaluated neck or low back pain or discomfort. One of those was a lab-based cross-sectional study on university students for 2 hours of computer use on neck and shoulder pain. They found that pain actually increased during this typing task despite the use of feedback. And then the other was on sedentary workers with 21 days of wear to assess back pain, and they found no group effect on change in back pain and no significant correlation between good posture hours and change in back pain. So the initial evidence isn't great, but the initial evidence is not particularly positive in terms of these kind of motion-based biofeedback wearables. Now, from a theoretical point of view, there is reason to believe that posture-based biofeedback wearables might not be the optimal use of industrial wearable technology, even though it is the most popular. The reason for that is if you look at the literature on occupational injury risk, particularly due to manual material handling, the number one risk factor, or I guess feature that predicts injury risk, is force. So how much force are they exerting? How much weight are they lifting? That sort of thing. The next best predictors are how much or how often they're doing it. So repetition and duty cycle. And then only lastly, do you have some significant features of posture in the Maris work on low back pain. The Harris-Adamson work on carpal tunnel syndrome actually didn't find any value to including posture in their models. So one of the reasons why posture-based biofeedback may not be an optimal use is you're looking at data that have low, what we call construct validity, which is that it's not directly tied to injury risk or very closely tied to injury risk. So there might be better ways to improve how we use wearables to assess the force, the force exposures that folks have. That might be why things like undersole sensing would be useful, as well as to understand the repetition, duty cycle, and postures. The other theoretical reason why it may not be the optimal use of wearable sensing is that the interventions, if you look at the hierarchy of controls, the most effective interventions are those that eliminate the hazard itself or substitute and replace the hazard with something of lower risk hazard. You also have engineering controls. And then below that, you get to administrative controls. And I would argue that these wearable sensing devices with posture-based biofeedback changes the way people work. So it's basically an instructional device on how to work and would represent an administrative control in that way, which, as you can see, based on the hierarchy of controls and some of the data associated with that, is less effective than other options. So I know I've given a bit of a pessimistic view on the efficacy of industrial wearable sensing. I actually have a very optimistic view of the potential for these devices. I just think we need to do a better job in the use cases of how we use them. So one of the benefits I see is that they do provide job analysis over task analysis. So I have seen anecdotes with clients of really identifying that it's the scheduling of one task followed by another that really is an enhancement of risk. And so being able to see an entire job over time, rather than spending time with manual observation of only a handful of employees at a time, being able to look at scale of your entire job force, see how the entire job force distribution of work occurs across an entire day's work is of great value, and can be more effective because you get more in-depth insights on patterns. The other benefit to wearables is, as I mentioned, the sensing devices have the option to provide simultaneous evaluation of the environment and the person while performing a task. So that systems identification of risk is feasible with the use of wearables. And so I think with improved use of multimodal sensing and also multiple sensors, along with improved form factor. So if we get away from the kind of hard shell cases that are strapped to a person's chest and move to more of a smart textile type of form factor, it'll enable us to have multimodal sensing with multiple sensors on a person without getting in the way of their work, which should allow us to better evaluate overexertion risk. They also have the potential to improve fall hazard identification. So we have sponsored some studies with the University of Michigan that have been published on identifying fall hazards in construction work sites just by analyzing how a person moves in their work site to identify potential fall risk. They also have the potential to improve emerging risks, if you will. These aren't really emerging risks, but duty of care for the employer is really starting to change and expand in scope due to the litigation pressures. And so it's really increasing the demand for risk management programs, particularly for heat stress and for fatigue, to be able to monitor at scale risks of heat strain and fatigue. So I think wearables have a chance to support those initiatives and help keep people safe and monitored at scale. So those are my thoughts on the efficacy of sensing wearables. Looking at employee acceptance of sensing wearables, I present to you a paper that was published with me as first author with a great study team at Liberty Mutual in 2019. It was basically a national survey study of over 1,000 employees that roughly mimicked the employed population of the United States. And what we found was that the number one predictor of employee acceptance is something called performance expectancy. And so what that means is they have to believe that the wearable is going to do the job you say it's going to do. So if the wearable is meant to improve their safety, they have to believe it will help improve their safety. If it is to improve their productivity, they have to believe it will improve their productivity. So that means that your number one task is to ensure sufficient evidence to support the employee's beliefs that the wearable works. Now, this is a struggle because I just told you that the literature in the scientific literature is not that great. And so it means that you need to have a good critical eye of what evidence your vendors have, what methods they use, and whether those methods translate to your organization. It's also important to focus your use case of workplace wearables to safety with data recorded only at work, as opposed to focusing on things like productivity or on data collection outside of work. So some of these wearable devices might evaluate your physical activity levels and sleep quality outside of work. And that has a lower level of acceptance than focusing on safety while only at work. One of the unique things we found in our study was that the second strongest predictor of employee acceptance was a positive safety climate. So what I mean by safety climate is that the employees perceive their direct supervisor and their organization prioritize safety to their benefit. And so we found that those who believe that are more likely to be willing to use wearable technology. And so that means, and in my view, that if an employee believes their employer has their best interests at heart, their safety in mind, they're more likely to trust the use of these devices. In addition, we asked employees who had already had experience with workplace wearables, what was their experience with it, and those who identified a positive past experience with wearables identified that they felt well involved and well informed as employees in the implementation process. So they were involved in being able to select the device and how it was implemented. They were informed, particularly on data ownership, data access and use, making sure no punitive use of the device and data could be used, how the data were secured, things of that nature. So being informed of those things was absolutely essential to a positive employee acceptance. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. It's not just my study that demonstrates this. I provide to you 10 other resources here, and you look at the themes of their findings. They relate perfectly to the article. So the top predictor is performance expectancy or perceived usefulness. Acceptance is higher for data recorded at work than for data outside of work. Acceptance is higher if you focus on health over organizational efficiency. Something I didn't mention in our study, but we did test and can attest to, is that incentives help. So providing monetary incentives to opt into the use of the device. Organizational culture matters, just as I said, safety climate matters, and data ownership, access, and use matter. So the literature is pretty sound here, demonstrating these key points. All right, so that's sensing wearables. The last piece of technology I would like to engage on is exoskeletons. So there are a number of different types of industrial exoskeletons. There are also non-industrial skeletons, such as for medical use or military use and the like. I'm focusing on industrial skeletons. There are different types. There are unpowered or passive devices. These use things like bungee cords or springs to help provide assistance to the individual while they work. There are also powered or active devices that use electronic motors to provide assistance to the person as they work. These have some benefit to provide dynamic assistance based on how the person is moving. And then you also have both rigid exoskeletons, so these look very much like a skeleton surrounding the body, as well as soft exosuits, which look more like backpacks with straps than a true skeleton. They can be focused to support different parts of the body. The most common in industrial use is upper limb and back exoskeletons, but there are lower limb, whole body, and hand exoskeletons out there to support work. With regard to effectiveness, again, the research community is really still evaluating this notion. This systematic review and meta-analysis by Baer and colleagues was well done. It demonstrates that the exoskeletons do reduce acute physical stress and strain in the target area during primarily lab use. So in this particular study, they did find that the biomechanic evaluation of force against a joint or the level of muscle activation was reduced in the target area when using exoskeletons. What they also rightly conclude is that the impact on workers' health is still unknown due to a lack of long-term workplace studies. So we still need those workplace studies. In another recent review by Fournier and colleagues, they focus on quality, productivity, and economic implications. They found that the effects of productivity really depend on the type of exoskeleton and tasks. So we're starting to find that task matching is essential. We're kind of coming off that hype curve that this is going to be a panacea to improve everybody's safety at work, and finding that there are niches, at least with current technology, that are best handled to support people with exoskeletons. And they really do reflect a combination of task, environment, and person. So there's more work to be done to specify those things, but we do know that there are use cases that are effective and those that are less effective. They do note that economic evaluations are still lacking, so we still have work to do and more research to do to identify the ROI or return on investment on exoskeletons, which of course is going to depend on the cost of implementation and the cost of the devices themselves. So a lot of individual factors at play there. The other thing they noted was that most 13 of 15 reviewed studies were lab-based, so we need those workplace studies. In another systematic review, this one I really liked because Baldessari and colleagues focused on field-based implementation of exoskeletons and what we know from that. They identified 24 field studies in this particular review. Only passive upper limb and back exoskeletons were represented. And then most studies were cross-sectional for only minutes or hours of wear. And what they found was that acceptance is not universal and can diminish with time. User satisfaction in field studies was essentially less brilliant than for lab studies, is something they noted. So they identified that the study quality in the field is currently low, most focus on usability and comfort rather than on injury reduction. Comfort and ease of use are key to adoption, and initial trends on injury suggest potential benefit, but only if worn and not a fix-all. And that sounds silly to say only if worn, but adherence to use is at issue here. And one of the better studies they reviewed that had long-term field use was that by Kim and colleagues in 2022, which represented an 18-month study at Ford, looking at a passive upper limb exoskeleton over 18 months. They found that about 60% indicate intent to use the device in the future. But for those that did adhere to use during that 18 months, their trends suggest reduced medical visits. They couldn't quite conclude on that because the number of people left in the study following data loss over 18 months was too low to confidently conclude. But I think it's fair to say that it's optimistic to show that reduced medical visits can occur. And there are some anecdotes by other manufacturers that have come forward publicly, folks like Toyota, to say that these passive upper limb exoskeletons have decreased things like shoulder injury rates for them as well. In terms of employee acceptance, exoskeletons are a unique technology here. So Most workplace technology acceptance literature suggests that performance expectancy, the belief that it'll work, is the #1 predictor of intent to use or employee acceptance. With exoskeletons, as you look from this Alprama and colleagues study, effort expectancy was actually the strongest correlate to intent to use or employee acceptance. And we've found this in the field ourselves anecdotally as we work with clients and pilots and the like. You can see some quotes here that reflect these kind of effort expectancy and performance expectancy concerns. Wanting less is more to get my work done, too much of a hassle. So really the prime directive for vendors with exosuits and exoskeletons is to make ease of use as easy as possible, to make form factor as out of the way as possible. So that'll be important in terms of design function. We also need some further study to really identify whether certain beliefs are true or not. So there is this kind of fear of deconditioning. You see the quote here, just like back braces, they'll make me weak. And so you have long memories for what happened with back braces, but also these kind of fears of deconditioning. Now, from kind of a physiological theoretical perspective, I don't see deconditioning ever being an issue with the current technology, particularly with the kind of light support that's given from the passive and active back and upper limb exoskeletons. Some of the full body ones perhaps maybe, but I don't see this as being a big issue. Nevertheless, we need better research to really prove that out. So in terms of safety and usability, some things to consider are increased heat and sweating. So the very workers who could benefit from exoskeletons are those that work hard, often in uncontrolled conditions that you can't use the substitution or elimination or even engineering controls to support. And those very conditions are the ones that increase risk for heat and sweating, heat stress and the like, to which these exoskeletons can increase discomfort for. Interaction with objects, equipment, environment, or people is at issue. Pressure or abrasion at contact points can happen, particularly over a day's use. Restricted movements, unintended movements, pinching or contact with sharp edges, instability or difficulty with balance, attention capacity and focus are all issues to consider, things that are under concern in the research literature and being tested. When I look practically at what I see most commonly in the field, increased heat or sweating is definitely #1. A lot of issue there. Unable to use in confined space if the form factor is not very small and close to the body. Unable to use with PPE, particularly fall arrest harnesses. I do know that certain vendors have tested this to allow the use of fall arrest harnessing with their device, and so I encourage you to check the evidence of your vendors on that. But even still, these tend to be for overhead harnessing. But if you're trying to harness somebody in a basket where the harness is coming down over the exosuit, which tend to be latched on at the waist in some way, that can be a challenge. And you always want to, of course, prioritize the fall arrest harnessing over an exoskeleton. You also have issues with interaction with belt-worn objects, tools, and devices. So if they have a tool belt, if they have a tablet that they attach to their belt or whatever it might be, those sorts of things can be at issue with exoskeletons. Rubbing due to straps does happen. In the harsh work environments, some durability issues have come up. Most vendors are very responsive to this and willing to change design to improve this. So I encourage you to have choose a vendor that has a good service model, willing to work on troubleshooting fit issues with your workers, willing to work on durability and changing the device to meet your needs. I am a member of the F48 Committee on Exoskeletons and Exosuits from ASTM. A lot of great work by this group and a lot of great support standards available to you today, with many more under development. So I recommend you check it out and that you check it out often because new resources are becoming available all the time. So that's my time here today. I just want to conclude that employee acceptance really requires deployments that focus on safety as opposed to productivity, that value the autonomy of your worker, that value ease of use, and partnership with your workers to be a partner in the evaluation and deployment. Despite expanding usage of these technologies, the effectiveness of many novel workplace safety technologies really remains under research, and more needs to be done. With that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse. If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. But if not, we just want to say thank you again. This recording will go out to everyone, so you'll have this presentation through the recording. And if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to send me or George a message, and then we will forward your email to Dr. Jacobs.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I
Yes.
got it, George.
Okay, sorry, yeah, because I was trying to ask a quick question. Thank you so much, Jesse, for one thing. But on those shoe inserts, has there been any development to make those any systems that you can buy that use those currently, or is it pretty much all research-based stuff?
There are a couple folks that have that option. Biggest concern right now is their durability. So, and that means ROI. So, to add them in, how long they last, how many hours of wear they have available to them, is at issue still. So there's still more work to be done. It is also still a research question in terms of their accuracy, because again, the sensor signal quality is not what you would get from an academic force plate.
Right, right. And then you need to have the integrated modeling to give you any kind of outputs that you can really utilize for risk assessment. So
absolutely,
thank you. Let's see. Are there any questions that came up in the chat, Lindsay?
No, just people are saying that they appreciated the talk. It's very interesting. Appreciate the information on what employees prioritize with regard to acceptance for each type. So
excellent.
Yeah, it was interesting the difference between with the exoskeletons. That acceptance kind of shifts. So
yeah, it's pretty interesting. And the other thing I'll note that we've learned from our testing in the field is that I didn't really mention is supervisor support. It's so important for employees to be allowed the time necessary to don and doff, to troubleshoot, fit issues, and to really just have the support or a champion in the kind of local supervisor state of the use of these technologies. So exoskeletons are a unique kind of acceptance issue where rather than performance expectancy, it's ease of use in addition to performance expectancy. And then that supervisor support appears to be key, just anecdotally from our experience.
That's great. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
thank you, Jesse. And we'll see everyone next month for our next session. So thank you, Dr. Jacobs.
All right. Thank you much.